everyone. So my name is Lynn Fuller. I'm the test prep teacher and tutor at the Shipley School for the SAT and ACT. Tonight we're going to review how to take the PSAT, which will be administered coming up in October. I just want to go through a couple of pointers to be able to get through the exam, especially if you're a first timer as a sophomore. Nothing to be afraid of. I know that it sounds like a scary, daunting task, but I promise it is manageable. But definitely use your PSAT packets to go through. It's actually the same packet as 2015. They rotate them every couple of years. So one of the first things we're going to look at is the test length. And so I've created a regular time, extended time, and double time chart for you. Regular time, you have 47 questions. That means there's 5 passages for the critical reading, typically a literature passage, an economics passage, a social science passage, a natural science passage, compare and contrast passage. They each have 9 questions. Generally, and you have about 12 minutes to complete it using standard time. So that's how you get to the 60 minutes. My recommendation with the critical reading, and we'll get into that as well, is a bit of a strategy, but my favorite one, especially if you're trying this out for the first time, make sure you're working in your booklet, in your test booklet, and then transfer your answers every column or page to the bubble sheet, not every single one. If you transfer it every single time, it's like taking a test while shaking your head. You're looking back and forth constantly, and that's not fun. It's also really distracting. So do your best to be able to answer your questions in your booklet by column or by page. That also brings me to the compare and contrast passage. There's an old saying, say, rob Peter to pay Paul. So if you do really well on, say, a literature passage or some sort of social science or economics passage early on, then you have probably saved yourself some time that you can use later on that compare and contrast passage that's going to take you a little bit longer to do. So wherever that falls in your bubble sheet, mark it off, skip it, and come back to it, because then you'll be able to use all that time you have left over. The last component for the critical reading is that if you do happen to run out of time, don't fret, but please feel free to guess, because you're no longer penalized for wrong answer on the new SAT. Which takes us to the second segment, which is writing or grammar. There are 44 questions here. They ask you questions about grammar content, punctuation, moving sentences around. As much as you're paying attention to fixing the grammar and structure, you need to pay attention to the content, because they're going to ask you main idea questions. So don't skim or skip words, read everything, and test those options back in. We'll get into some strategies in a different video. The next segment that you'll have is a math no calculator. Now, some folks have accommodations to have that calculator, but for the most part, everybody is not allowed to use a calculator. They're going to ask you really good math concepts and functions, equations of the line, lots of things about geometry, circles, triangles, specifically 30, 60, 90, 45, 45, 90, and 3, 4, 5. As long as you're labeling everything and writing everything out, you should be fine with the computation, because it's not complicated computation. Which leads us to the last section, which is math with a calculator. And there you're allowed to break out your TI-84s, your Inspires, and your standard calculators to be able to compute. So as long as you write down every step so you don't miss a sign or raising to a power, that's really going to help you here. So the PSAT content areas for the critical reading, they're going to ask you lots of different questions. They're going to ask you, what's the main idea of the passage? What can you infer? Where are the supporting details coming from for these types of questions? How are they using this vocabulary word in context of the passage? And of course, compare and contrast. So if you know what kinds of questions you're up against ahead of time, there's no need to read them, especially if you practice it, because you're going to be asked essentially the same kinds of questions for every single passage. It's a standardized exam after all. So they need to be able to compare the scores from March to May to June to August to October to November to December. And yes, this is a PSAT, but it's a practice of the SAT. So the questions are essentially the same. So as long as you read through a couple of practice reading passages and questions, you should not have a problem with the types of questions. So I would always focus on reading the passage first rather than trying to memorize the types of questions, because they're going to be essentially the same from passage to passage. The second component of the test is the writing, which is really grammar and structure. So grammar questions, there are about 7 or 8 types of grammar questions that they will ask. There's lots of stuff about punctuation now. We have commas, colons, semicolons, apostrophes, en dash, parentheses, and they're going to use them in a variety of ways, and we'll go through that in the writing section. They're going to ask you content questions. Should we move this content? Should we rephrase this content? Should we delete this content? Which means we have to pay attention to the content. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to the main ideas there. And finally, structure. Do we need to reorder this paragraph? Should we move this sentence? Should we break this paragraph into 2? So they're going to ask you structure-based questions. And finally, the last 2 sections of the test, math. So the rumor has it that the August SAT, which scores just came out, had a lot more geometry than the past 2 years of the new SAT, or a year and a half of the new SAT. I think our students are really well prepared with geometry, especially because we focus so much on shapes and how they relate and understanding them conceptually. So the geometry foundation, especially at Shipley, is excellent. So just focus on your 30, 60, 90s, your 45, 45, 90s, your rectangles, your 3D objects, your circles. They give you all of those formulas in every single math section before you ever begin answering any questions. The next component is trigonometry. SOHCAHTOA, if you remember, SOHCAHTOA, right? Chant it. Sine, cosine, and tangent. So stands for opposite over hypotenuse. Ka stands for cosine or adjacent over hypotenuse, and TOA stands for tangent or opposite over adjacent. Pre-calc is unit circle. They touch upon it. You may get a question. Do not fret. Do not run to go take a pre-calculus class because you think you need to know all this stuff about unit circle. Honestly, it takes 10 minutes for anybody to explain the 2 problems and sort of make this bridge between the geometry, the trigonometry, into the pre-calculus. But they do ask basic questions about quadrant 1 of unit circle, if you're familiar. That's traditionally where all sine, cosine, and tangent are positive. It's between 0 and 90 degrees on the unit circle. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look at Khan Academy. It's a really easy intro. It takes 10 minutes. And if you're working with those triangles right now, it'll make a lot of sense of what's going on and how they connect it. Algebra 1, they're going to ask you to write an equation of the line. They're going to ask for slope. They're going to ask for those kinds of things. Algebra 2, functions, function shifts, translations, plugging into a function. Probability and statistics. So they're going to ask you about surveys and survey information and where that comes from. They're also going to ask you statistical information. So is this part of a standard deviation? They're going to ask other types of statistical based information. And word problems, of course, it's the SAT after all. It's usually a longer word problem. My advice to you with any of the word problems on any of the exams that you ever take here, whether it's SAT or ACT in the future, read the question, make sure you know exactly what you're answering, and then when you're finished and you think you've answered the question, read it again. Because a lot of times you'll solve for X because that's the first term you'll find, and then they want Y. So you have to go back and plug it in. But of course, they'll give you X as the answer. So you want to make sure that you're being clear. So PSAT preparedness. So it's coming up. Make sure that prior you get a really good night's sleep, if not 2. You just want to go in well rested. Eat well in the days leading up to your exam. Think protein-rich foods, not carb loading. We're not going for a pancake breakfast every single day. And eat protein-rich foods the morning of the exam. So think eggs and turkey bacon and toast with peanut butter versus the bagel and the schmear. So if you want to go for the IHOP breakfast after the PSAT, by all means go for it, but you will want to sleep by 10:30 if you're trying to eat all the carbs and the sugar ahead of time, because you get that spike in energy and then you just want to fall asleep. Also bring number 2 sharpened pencils. Bring a calculator, make sure it's charged or the batteries have been changed the night before, and bring a snack and a water bottle. Usually when you take practice tests with me on Saturdays, you'll see the ones that are coming up in the future. I always have some munchkins because a nice little burst of sugar halfway through the test is a good thing. Granola bars and water, they're always good things to bring. Stay tuned for a couple more videos. Of course, if you have any questions, go back to the beginning of the video. Feel free to shoot me an email at any time, especially if you want to review any of the questions in the PSAT packet. Thanks.